So in my last video, I made a slightly more than offhanded comment about how my feelings towards Requiem were not good. I don't think any game in recent memory, maybe even going further than that, has sucked the hype out of me into the vacuum of space faster than Resident Evil Requiem has. I went from pretty optimistic to cautiously optimistic to I will not buy this game unless it's $10 on a sale. Basically in the span of like 2 trailers. I made a quick little poll on my channel and most people wanted to hear exactly why I'm so disappointed in what Resident Evil Requiem seems to be doing. So I'm going to make this is all off the dome. I have no notes, I have no script, I have nothing. I'm just going to tell you from the core of my being why Resident Evil Requiem looks like it's going to be painful to me. But before I get into that exactly, let me at least tell you where I am as a Resident Evil fan. So I started playing Resident Evil when I was 13 years old. My first game was the remake on the GameCube. I've been with the series ever since. I have been obsessed with the series ever since. It is, without a doubt, one of my most favorite franchises, and it is a franchise and game series that I always come back to some extent. I've beaten the Resident Evil Remake 10 times. I've beaten Resident Evil 2 5 or 6 times. I've beaten Resident Evil 2 Remake 3 times. I've beaten Resident Evil 4 15 times. I've beaten Resident Evil 4 Remake 3 times. There are some games in this franchise that are like big entries, like I've never beaten Code Veronica. I've never beaten Resident Evil 3. I've never beaten Resident Evil 3 Remake. But what about those old games do I like? You may think this is just an old fuck that likes fixed cameras, and if it's not a fixed camera game, he doesn't like it. Believe me, that is not true. I think Resident Evil 4 Remake is better than Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 4 is one of the best games ever made. What I liked about the older games is that they are a contained puzzle box. I've talked about this on my channel so many times. If you want to hear me go about it more in detail, you can look back at like basically any video that I'm talking about like an old horror game in. Or even my Fixing Survival Horror game video that I made a little while ago. Which I would highly recommend. I do think that if you're here, you should watch that video. But I think Resident Evil, the original trilogy especially, including Code Veronica, it is a gigantic puzzle box that is very meticulously designed. You will get lost. You have all of these items you have to manage, maintain, and I think one of the most underutilized aspects in modern Resident Evil games is backtracking. Aside from the puzzle box, aside from the backtracking, aside from the inventory management and like the micromanaging and the tough decisions that you have to make due to the item management, is simply that those games are incredibly focused. Resident Evil 1 is the same game from start to finish. It is incredibly well designed, and its horror is what keeps the tension rampant throughout its entire runtime. Sure, when you get to the guest house, it spices it up a little bit with new enemy varieties, a slightly smaller contained puzzle box, but no gameplay mechanism is drastically changed. No gameplay thematical focus is dramatically changed. Its focus is dead fucking center from frame 1 until you blow that tyrant up with a fucking bazooka. And I would even argue that Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 5 are incredibly focused experiences. Where their focus is placed varies a little bit and dramatically depending on the game, but you will never, in any circumstance, hear anybody argue that Resident Evil 4, even if it shifts into an action-focused horror game, is not focused. That game takes 15 to 18 hours to beat, It is the same game from start to finish. There are little variances introduced as the game goes on. There are fun little segments like the minecart, the lake monster fight. But these are small little bumps that all coalesce back into the singular straight line that you go down to, and you shoot enemies in the knee, you roundhouse kick them in the face, and then you suplex their head off. There is no argument to be made that Resident Evil 4 and 5 are still unfocused games. The Resident Evil trilogy, quadrilogy, including Resident Evil Code Veronica, are all incredibly focused. The most unfocused game of that old quadrilogy is Code Veronica, and even that is kind of stretching it a little bit. It introduces some new gameplay elements to the franchise, but it is a core Resident Evil game through and through, from start to finish. Where things start getting a little dicey is Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6 is this game that I don't think people really remember how much of like a slap in the face it was to a lot of fans of the franchise. As someone that wanted Resident Evil to go back to its horror roots, despite my enjoyment of 5 and my diehard love for number 4, Resident Evil 6 was an amalgamation of every idea that Capcom could put into a video game and cranked to 15. They didn't even stop at 11. Some aspects of Resident Evil 6 are fun. Leon's campaign is pretty decent. It gets batshit stupid, but it's fun as fuck and hilarious.
Aim for the dynamite!
But that game is a clusterfuck. That is the first mainline entry in the entire franchise that didn't know what the fuck it was. Okay? I don't hate Resident Evil 6 to its core, but I do hate what it is as an entry as a Resident Evil game. Because it is 3.5 different games shoved into 4 or 5 campaigns. It's absurd. Sometimes in a good way, mostly in a bad way. Now, after Resident Evil 6, Capcom thankfully did something smart, which is look at themselves, look at the franchise of Resident Evil and ask, what are we trying to do with this? Resident Evil 6 famously did not sell well enough, even though it did sell pretty decently. But it failed in sales enough that Capcom decided to take a step back and thankfully return the franchise back to its roots. I don't think Resident Evil 7 is nearly as good as people say it is, but I will never say that I don't appreciate the fuck out of it, because it is Capcom realizing the error of their ways and trying to earn back the trust of fans of the franchise by taking what Resident Evil had become and saying, what was this franchise to begin with? And they made a pure survival horror game. Now, my issues with Resident Evil 7 range from nitpicks to pretty big critiques. But I think the most common through line is that it is still an unfocused video game. Not by much, but it's still kind of unfocused. And my biggest example of this is that there is no big puzzle box. Now, you may argue that the mansion is a big puzzle box. The mansion you do come back to at some point in the game, but the core mansion experience, the one that you start the game in to the point where you leave the mansion officially for at least some period of time, even if you don't know what you're doing, can be finished in 2 hours. It is nowhere near long enough for you to soak everything in, be lost in it, and actually experience what it feels like to relive even half of the Resident Evil 1 Mansion's puzzle box. And then when you leave it, you go to the guest house. And the guest house is like a weird hide and seek section. Now, you are hide and seeking from Jack Baker, but at the same time, you are still playing a classic Resident Evil Mansion puzzle box with the added addition of a stalker enemy. You're essentially playing a tiny Resident Evil 2 into a pure hide and seek area. And then after you do that, you go to an even smaller area that is a weird psychological horror section. And then you go to Lucas's section, which is just the movie Saw. When there is combat, it is bombastic. It doesn't feel remotely connected to anything else you're doing. It feels like an arcade action game shoved into a Resident Evil game. But okay, it concludes pretty well. People talk shit on the boat. It is a adequate and proper level of action that feels like an ending of a classic Resident Evil game. I think Resident Evil 7 is a well-intentioned C+. It never knows when to let it breathe, except for the very beginning, and as soon as you exhale, it's over. Now, I remember thinking, after beating Resident Evil 7, that Capcom took a stab at their old formula. They learned a lot of lessons, and hopefully the next one would be the game I always wanted, but a new entry that felt like an old game. And then Resident Evil 2 Remake came out, and it was everything I ever wanted a modern Resident Evil game to feel like. It is incredible how good that game is. It is a massive puzzle box. It is the old game updated. It is almost hard to put into words how perfect of a remake and an execution of the original kind of game design that Resident Evil was built off of translated into the modern era that Resident Evil 2 Remake is. And I thought Capcom figured it out. They did it. They have this perfect template to base Resident Evil off of now. And then Resident Evil Village comes out. What are we doing here? Resident Evil Village is a self-described carnival where each segment of the game is no more than 2 hours. Each segment of the game is dramatically different from each other. You go from a Resident Evil 4 Village, a bombardment action set piece, to a Resident Evil puzzle box that is like an hour and a half long. You go from that back to the core village into a escape room where you don't shoot anything that takes like an hour to beat, into a boss rush mode that takes an hour to beat, into kind of sort of a classic Resident Evil style level again, and then it ends with an action set piece that rivals Resident Evil 4. It is 5 individual games crammed into one clusterfuck. There is no focus. There is no vision other than wouldn't it be cool if all of these things happened. I think that Resident Evil Village is the worst Resident Evil game since 6. It is an unmitigated clusterfuck. Because Resident Evil 7 was this promise of returning the franchise back to its roots. And while it had its problems, its heart was in the right place. And in one single game, Capcom said, let's make it an action game again. And I remember being really worried that Resident Evil 9, whenever it came around, would be Resident Evil 6 again. I bet you know why I don't want Resident Evil Requiem to be the way it is now, but if you don't by now, Resident Evil Requiem, while it's not as bombastically gargantuan as Resident Evil 6 is, Resident Evil Requiem is the fear that I had when I beat Resident Evil Village, which is they're just going to make Resident Evil 6 again. Resident Evil Requiem is already a game I know from the onset is a game with no focus. It's a game where Capcom said, let's have our cake and eat it too. It's a game that they said, let's make a game for everyone. Let's make a game that can be action-filled and also be a survival horror game. Every time I look at Resident Evil Requiem, I get upset. They have the template for the best Resident Evil game that they could ever make in the Resident Evil 2 remake. and they refuse to acknowledge its existence in any game that they make afterwards. The template, the core design philosophy of the franchise from its initial release has been updated and perfected in the Resident Evil 2 remake, and they just insist on piling different things on top of it to the point where it's barely recognizable as a puzzle box or even just as a focused survival horror game. We are no longer in the realm of Resident Evil trying to be a horror game. Already, in 3 entries, it is barely a horror game, and so much more clearly focused on being an action game. I can almost guarantee you that Resident Evil Requiem, going back to Raccoon City, promising that you're going to explore this city, is going to be 3 or 4 locations that you play twice every single time, and each time that you play them, you can beat it in an hour and a half, 2 hours tops per character. That is not a puzzle box. That is not a focused game. That is a clusterfuck that I refuse to experience at full price. Resident Evil Requiem looks like the worst lessons that Capcom could have possibly learned in its revival of its most popular franchise. I am so bummed that Resident Evil can't make a new entry that feels like an old one. They have to make a new entry that does all of these things kind of good at best and half-hearted at worst. Requiem is going to be one of the highest rated games in the franchise. I know it's going to be, but so was Village, and I think that game sucks. I am so disheartened by the direction that Resident Evil has taken. I don't need them to be fixed cameras. I don't even need them to be a puzzle box. Resident Evil 4 Remake is arguably better than the original, and the original is one of the best games ever made. I prefer the remake over the original, and that game is not a puzzle box. It doesn't try to be a puzzle box. It is a straight line that has puzzle boxes, but you know that's fine because it's an action game. Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 8 try to be puzzle boxes. They try to be horror games. They try to convince you that they're designed like the old ones, and they're not even a little bit. And Resident Evil Requiem looks like a bad game. It breaks my heart that I'm not even remotely hyped for it. I will not be buying it. I will not be playing it. When the game is $10, maybe I'll pick it up. But until then, I'm going to watch the scores for that game be like across the board. I guarantee you, Metacritic is going to be like 93. I'll probably at best give it a 6 out of 10. It breaks my heart. Hopefully, they remake Code Veronica and I can experience like a relatively focused game again. Thanks for listening to me ramble. I really needed to get this off my chest. I will not be buying Resident Evil Requiem. Goodbye.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.
Resident Evil Requiem kept me completely absorbed and consistently entertained, whether it was all hair-raising or all guns blazing.